Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Edge Computing, Real-Time Insights that Deliver Real Results, sponsored by Dell Technologies on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Kirsten Billhart, the Global Marketing Director for the Edge Solutions Group at Dell Technologies, Zach Goldstein, the Chief Information Officer and the Director of High Performance Computing and Communications at NOAA, Mac Townsend, Architecture and Engineering in the CIO's Office at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Lieutenant General Bruce Crawford, the CIO G6 for the U.S. Army. Before break, we were understanding the edge and really this new definition of what edge computing is becoming with this whole coronavirus. One of the big issues that I think came up during this discussion is the network itself. And I want to start there with Mac from DIA. One of the things about extending the network, modernizing the network, but it's also this network modernization piece is the broader piece of IT modernization. Mac, start with how you guys are dealing with that network piece, because if the network doesn't work, it doesn't matter what you do at the edge.
Right, Jason, that's a really good point. And obviously, with the sensors, like Zach brought up about the weather capabilities, I mean, we're getting weather reports for 6-mile radiuses in every 15 minutes, for example, out of NOAA. And we're getting information from Army sensors from Bruce that are happening overnight almost. And so what's happening is we have this vast amount of data that's coming in on these sensors, and we need to sort of bring it down to something that we can utilize. Now, we are modernizing our networks as much as we can. We're putting a huge emphasis on the classified networks and trying to bring those up to 100 gigabyte kinds of capabilities and things of that nature. But we understand that we're not ever going to be able to match the amount of data that's coming out of the Internet of Things or the various different types of sensors that are coming as we go forward. And so I think that a lot of the modernization that we're looking at is not just about upgrading hardware on network devices and things of that nature, but also figuring out the strategies of how we can triage data at the source and move things back towards a more centralized cloud environment, generally speaking. And to do that, we're looking at a lot of these edge devices and things of that nature. So Kirsten, maybe you can go into a little bit about, what we're doing with some of the devices, because things like the Dell Rail systems and things of that nature are some of the componentry that we're using for this.
Well, thank you, Mac, and we certainly appreciate the relationships that we have throughout the federal government. Mac, you raised a really important point, is that the quantity of data is only going up. As we know, it's growing exponentially. Jason, you started out quoting some IDC, and we certainly like to quote them as well. IDC predicts that by 2025, we're going to have 175 trillion gigabytes of data in the world, and that's compared to just 33 trillion gigabytes back in 2018. So, as you expand and modernize those networks, it's going to be really challenging to keep up from that ever increasing amount of data coming in. And so what that means, I think that's a big reason why we're all more and more interested in edge computing. It's that capacity to leverage the edge and run some analysis right there to ingest, to filter, to compress, to bring out the most important bits of information and only send a smaller, smarter data stream over the wider network to a data center or a cloud environment. So kind of thinking, we're talking about the weather with NOAA, we don't really need to know every 2 seconds, it's raining, it's raining, it's raining, it's raining. What you do need to know is that at time XYZ, it started raining, it was raining this hard, and then it stopped at this amount of time, there's missed this amount of water. It's just like a summary of information that is truly, truly valuable. And so you can reduce that amount of data at the edge, pulling out those key bits that are helpful in a data center or cloud environment to run deeper, more predictive analysis and to become smarter as a weather organization to predict where the next storm may be coming from. So again, it's just taking advantage of all the goodness that comes with that data, but not letting it overwhelm you. And that edge is a huge enabler to reduce that data and make it manageable over your networking capabilities and in your other computing centers.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to kind of tug on that string because it's almost like all roads lead to a discussion about data. And then there's the discussion about making hard decisions on the front end about how we're actually architecting our networks to account for that data. So I'd like to kind of pull the string on both of those. Where the Army is right now is we're going to spend about $733 million in the next 24 months on our journey to the cloud, which includes a massive, you could probably argue, one of the world's most largest migrations of data, just given the Army is the third largest organization of any kind in the world. But when you tie those 2 points together, the discussion about data and the discussion about architects, there's a couple of questions, strategic questions that you've got to ask yourself up front. And I think it comes down to this. So what data, to Kirsten's point, must be processed independent of the enterprise? And there are a couple of good examples out there. So if you look at the Tesla, all right, it's always communicating back to Mecca, very likely. But because you're driving a car and sometimes it's driving you, there are some decisions that have got to be made rapidly based on the compute power on the actual platform. If you're driving on the road and you've got to stop, that car, that vehicle has got to make some instantaneous decisions. It didn't have time, to Kirsten's point, to go back to Mecca to ask, should I stop? Another good example is Waze. So there's some data that's required on the platform. You don't need to know every left or turn. You don't need to know where every policeman is or every traffic cam is on the road. There are some things that remain on the platform that are unique to that particular platform that you need kind of almost in real time. And so my fundamental point here, as we are pull those two threads, as we are architecting the network to provide the flexibility that I talked about before, there are some front-end decisions that have to be made that have to do with what decisions by the user are going to have to be made and what data is going to be required on that actual platform that's independent of the reach back to Mecca. And that occurs as we start to talk about what and I'm using air quotes here for those who can't see me, the tactical edge. That becomes increasingly important given the dynamic nature of the battlefield. I just thought I'd offer that to kind of pull the network modernization thread into back to, again, all roads lead to a discussion of data into the data discussion. If that makes any sense, over.
It does, and I think I just want to bring Zach into the discussion because as you guys are not just looking at the network, you also have to look at the applications because I think as Lieutenant General Crawford made the really great point of certain decisions have to be made at that application level. So that takes a modernization of the applications. That's part of that IT modernization discussion. Zach, jump in here and talk a little bit about NOAA's perspective and how you guys are balancing the network and the broader IT modernization goals.
So the edge places a lot of stress on networks, and that's what we're talking about. The AI project I alluded to earlier in this conversation is designed to help us not only conserve bandwidth when you're loading terabytes of data down from a satellite, and you only need the most important information per model, and also you don't want to take the time for human quality assurance of that data, which is something else we do. So we have we call it an incubator project funded out of our high performance computing program to look at how we can use AI at the edge or right behind the edge, I guess, to not only save human interaction and save bandwidth, but also to improve the forecast by making sure that the data that arrives first is the data that's most valuable in terms of the accuracy of the forecast. A lot of the data ends up being archived that may not be immediately of use, and the ability to automatically discern without having to have human intervention not only saves bandwidth, but it improves the forecast itself. Other places where we have networking issues, and despite the fact that we have 100 gigabit per second national backbone to move these masses of data around among our supercomputers, from our satellites, and so on. The edge itself still presents unique challenges. Sort of a reverse argument that shows how far we've come was a number of years ago, I was visiting the NOAA ship Thomas Jefferson, and the captain of the ship proudly displayed to me his floating data center. And the floating data center was for the purpose of processing bathymetric readings so that we could, on the fly, make changes to nautical charts. But the main reason why the data center had to be floating was because there was such poor bandwidth connectivity from the ship to shore. Now that we're improving that with VSAT and other technologies, we're able actually to move the processing away from the edge, so that we can use more sophisticated tools and more rapidly update the nautical charts, which we then distribute to the world. I expect with the advancing of technology further, we'll be achieving a different balance and be able to, for example, do the processing immediately, which I think we still do, but maybe faster, so that when we're surveying a channel subsequent to a hurricane, one of the things we did with Sandy, obviously we forecasted the path of Sandy, and polar orbiting satellites were critical to that. But after Sandy did its business in the New York metropolitan area, the port was immediately closed. The Coast Guard couldn't open up the port until NOAA, and specifically the Thomas Jefferson, had resurveyed the port of New York, and there was Coast Guard cutter behind the Thomas Jefferson dropping new channel markers because hurricanes change channels. So the edge computing at that point is providing the immediate location of where that channel marker goes to the Coast Guard cutter that's in back of the TJ. So things have changed. Other things that are challenging us, though, at the edge, we have deployed meteorologists. This is similar to the forward line of battle that the Army has to deal with, except it's a forest fire. And there's meteorologists right at the front lines telling the incident commander which way the wind is blowing, critical for smoke jumpers, what's the microclimate that the fire itself is generating, what's happening around it. And that meteorologist has in his hands a terminal for our AWIP system, which is exactly the same system that we use in our hundreds of weather forecasting offices around the country. The challenge is he's got the compute, but how much bandwidth do they have there, and can we use RF, can we use cellular? It's a challenge. They need the compute at the edge, though, because if they get cut off, and this is similar to a deployed military, you always have to deal with the possibility that you operate alone. They need that computing power. So that's another use case where the network is a challenge.
Let me jump in real quick, because one of the things that you brought up was this AI project. And I'd love to get Kirsten involved, because this part, that concept of that AI project, which I think is fascinating, is part of this broader discussion about, I think, IT modernization, and this idea of it's not just the network, which is important in and of itself, but it's the applications that are running on the network. So Kirsten, jump in here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, AI systems and machine learning systems, they run on data. Data is their fuel. And so being able to have a path to the edge so that they're ingesting the most timely, relevant, up-to-date data as possible is going to keep the insights coming out of your AI and machine learning systems fresh and relevant. So what it shows is that the whole fabric of technology is a continuum. The cloud, we're talking about the edge, but you know, clouds are absolutely here to stay. They're a fundamental part of your technology architecture, and it's not just one cloud, right? Most organizations are using a multi-cloud strategy for a number of reasons, and you have multiple data centers, and then you can have, you know, thousands, if not millions, of edges. So being able to think of that as a fabric, a technology architecture, so that you can move data and then analyze those workloads where it matters, while it matters, using that right level of compute needed for the job is I think what most organizations are striving for. And so having that consistent fabric and thinking about the orchestration and the security and the manageability and virtualization and all these underlying enablers is going to give you that capability, right? To run the right data at the right place at the right time, to feed these amazing new capabilities we have with AI and ML with fresh fuel, fresh data to keep your front lines informed with the most highest quality information possible.
Just real quick on that one, and then hand off to Bruce and back to Zach again. I think that the biggest thing that we're talking about here when we're dealing with this hybrid cloud environment and trying to knit all this data together as we're going forward is the mechanisms by which we run distributed analytics. Right now, in most environments, you have to have all your data in one big spot or one big virtual area to run an analytic, to run a query against that information, to try and derive value from all these different disparate data sources. And I think that it's going to be important as we go forward in the future to think more and more about how we can run distributed analytics and then combine the information from the various different distributed analytic components back into something that can provide a holistic answer as we're going forward.
General Crawford, let me bring you in because one of the things you had mentioned to me probably about a year or so ago is an app rationalization effort. I think if I remember correctly, it's something like 5,000 or 8,000 apps you guys had, and you want to get it down to a better number. And I think that's part of this discussion. The right app at the right time, modernized on the cloud, at the edge. Where are you guys with that effort, and how's that kind of fit into that broader IT modernization?
Yeah, this was probably a little over a year ago as we were, I won't say we were starting our cloud journey, but then our undersecretary, who is now our secretary of the Army, had started to pull the team in for a more comprehensive discussion about. So what does our cloud future deliverables look like? And what's the relationship of migrating our data and applications to inform what the next instantiation of our cloud effort is going to be? So a couple of things. Number one, where we are with that. We literally shifted from a focus on applications to a real institutional transition across the Army to a focus on our data. And in some cases, separating the data from the actual applications. And we had discussions about everything from how are we going to protect it, how are we going to get after the balance between the need to protect our data to the need to defend our networks. And the discussion and the feedback General Fogarty and I gave them in the context of the security piece of this, it's not a binary decision. We actually have to do both. So where we are now is more focused on the data than we are on the application. But what the Army did, which was pretty interesting, in November, we actually put out an execution order to the entire Army to take a step back and look at all 4 mission areas: the business mission area, and this is the data in those mission areas, the intelligence mission area, the warfighting mission area, which is a lot germane to what we're talking about now, and the enterprise mission area. And the fundamental premise of this is, listen, so not everything is going to migrate to a cloud hosting environment. So what's our mechanism going to be to divest of, in this particular case, non-authoritative data sources? So there's a resourcing piece to this, but to bring it forward to the AI and ML discussion, so it makes no sense to put AI and ML tools on top of dirty data. And so what this allowed the Army to do is divest of non-authoritative legacy data sources. And so that when you're in that environment and you're leveraging AI and ML, there's a trust aspect to it that we didn't have before. Ultimately, if the user doesn't trust the data, meaning they're getting inaccurate readings, et cetera, then you have to ask yourself a hard question about the importance of your effort. And so that's kind of where we are right now. I believe that we also took another bold step inside the Army and stood up what's called an Enterprise Cloud Management Office. Well, we did something the Army hadn't done, is we actually centralized the oversight of our entire cloud effort and I went outside the Army and brought in Mr. Paul Puckett from Pivotal, I believe is where Paul was, to actually oversee that effort. And so I mentioned the amount of resources that we're going to spend, almost $800 million between now and FY23 on this effort. But I think we are fundamentally in a different place than we were before, looking specifically at the migration effort of our data that's going to be required to really deliver and bring our cloud effort to life. Over.
All right, plenty to dig out there. We got to get into the data discussion, which we'll do when we take after this break, but we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion Edge Computing, Real-Time Insights that Deliver Real Results, sponsored by Dell Technologies on Federal News Network.